Billionaire walked into the living room and saw his mother crying in the arms of the black gateman. Then he revealed a shocking truth. "What are you doing with my mother?" Daniel Sterling's voice echoed through the grand Sterling estate, breaking the silence like a crack of lightning. The storm outside raged with fierce thunder, shaking the glass windows as rain poured down hard. In the center of the room, beneath the shining chandelier, Margaret Sterling flinched. At 70, she still held herself with grace. Her silver hair framed a face full of tears, her pearl necklace trembling against her chest as she sobbed. But it wasn't the storm outside or her son's anger that kept her steady. It was the man beside her, James Whitfield, the black gateman who had stood at the Sterling gates for more than 30 years. His worn navy jacket didn't quite match the marble floors and fancy curtains, but his strong arms held Margaret close, keeping her upright as though protecting her from the storm, both outside and inside the mansion. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his jaw clenched tight, his fists shaking at his sides. His sharp eyes moved back and forth between the woman who had raised him and the man he had trusted his whole life to stand at the gates. But here he was, inside, holding her. The servants stood quietly in the corners, their whispers sliding through the air. Daniel's voice rang out, breaking the fragile silence of the room, his fury clear. "What the hell are you doing with my mother?" His words pierced the tension like a knife. The storm outside raged as if mirroring his inner turmoil, thunder crackling, rain pounding against the windows, shaking the entire mansion. But inside, the scene before him was more unbearable than any storm. Margaret, his mother, stood trembling, her hands gripping James Whitfield's worn navy jacket as she cried into his chest. The black gateman who had served the family for over 30 years held her with an unexpected gentleness. His arms, though weathered, seemed out of place in the opulent room. James was a man of strength and silence, the guardian of their gates. He had spent decades outside, protecting the family's privacy, never once stepping over the line into their personal lives. But now, here he was, holding Margaret in a way Daniel couldn't understand. Daniel froze, his eyes darting from the woman who had given him everything to the man who had always been a fixture in the background. His mother's silver hair glimmered under the chandelier's light, her pearl necklace trembling against her chest as she sobbed. His fists clenched at his sides, his mind reeling. "What game is this?" he asked, voice shaking with disbelief. Margaret tried to speak, her voice breaking. "Daniel, please, you don't understand." But Daniel cut her off, his voice loud and commanding. "Don't you dare, Mother. Do you know what this looks like? Do you know the shame this brings?" His anger was like a wave crashing against the rocks, relentless and overwhelming. He pointed sharply at James. "You, of all people, in my house, holding my mother?" James stood tall, his gaze steady despite the storm raging around them. His grip on Margaret never wavered, but his voice was calm, almost too calm for the chaos surrounding them. "Mr. Sterling, it's not what you think. Your mother needed someone." Daniel's face flushed with rage. "Needed someone." His laugh was bitter and empty. "You're telling me she needed you? You who've stood outside our gates for years, never stepping inside, never once crossing that line?" The servants had gathered in the corners of the room, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. They whispered among themselves, their voices barely audible. "Did you see that? He's touching her. The master will tear him apart." Margaret, still in James's arms, turned to face Daniel, her eyes filled with tears. "Daniel, please, you're wrong. James is not what you think. He was only trying to help me." But Daniel's fury would not yield. "Help you?" he snapped, his voice rising with each word. "To play the role of my father? To steal what doesn't belong to you?" The storm outside howled louder, as if trying to drown out the rising tension inside the room. Daniel's body shook with anger, his fists trembling at his sides. But beneath his rage, a feeling he could not name stirred in the pit of his stomach. Confusion, humiliation, and something deeper. A pain that went beyond the surface, but he refused to acknowledge it. Not yet. James's gaze met Daniel's, unwavering and steady. His silence spoke volumes. "Mr. Sterling, I have never betrayed this family. Not once." Daniel's chest tightened as the words settled in the air between them. "You think you're the one who's loyal? You, the servant? The one who spent his life standing guard at the gates, now playing the hero?" The servants held their breath, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. They had never seen Daniel like this, so lost in his anger, so willing to destroy the man who had served their family faithfully. Some of them exchanged glances, whispering, "What's happening? Why is he so angry?" Daniel's fingers stabbed the air, pointing directly at James. "You've spent 30 years working for this family, James, and this is how you repay us? By crossing the line? By touching my mother like that?" Margaret's voice, small and pleading, interrupted Daniel's tirade. "Please, Daniel, you don't understand. James has done nothing wrong. He was just here for me. I was in pain. I needed someone." But Daniel's rage only grew. He shoved a hand toward the door. "Get out! Get out of my house, James, before I have security throw you out!" James's expression softened, but he stood his ground. "I will leave, Mr. Sterling, but know this. Truth doesn't stay buried forever. You will regret this." Daniel laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "The only regret I'll have is trusting you with our gates for so long." Margaret tried to steady herself, reaching out with trembling hands. "Daniel, please stop. You're making a mistake." But Daniel was too far gone. His anger had clouded his judgment, his pride driving him to the edge. He shook off his mother's hand, blind to the hurt in her eyes. He couldn't see what she saw. He couldn't understand the loyalty James had given, the sacrifices he had made for this family. James straightened his posture, his eyes steady, despite the growing tension in the room. His voice was calm, though laced with sorrow. "Mr. Sterling, I have always been loyal to this family. I have never betrayed anyone, least of all your mother." His words were not defensive, but they carried the weight of years spent in silence and service. Daniel's anger flared, but there was something else beneath it, a deep, aching feeling he couldn't name, something gnawing at him as he stood there, glaring at James. His fists clenched tighter, his knuckles white. "Loyalty?" Daniel's voice was bitter, filled with scorn. "You think I'll buy that? You've stood at my gates for 30 years, James. That's all you've done. You're nothing but a servant. And now you think you can come in here and touch my mother?" James didn't flinch. His expression remained unreadable, though there was a flicker of something, perhaps regret or understanding, in his deep-set eyes. "I didn't ask for this, Daniel. I didn't want to be in this position, but your mother needed me. She was in distress. She collapsed." Daniel's jaw tightened, his body trembling with rage. "And you caught her? You think that justifies this?" He took a step forward, closing the gap between them. His eyes burned with accusation. "You think it's okay to touch her, to hold her like that?" Margaret, still standing there, her tears now staining her cheeks, reached out with trembling hands. "Daniel, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "James is not what you think. He's not—" But Daniel cut her off, his voice rising above hers. "I understand perfectly," he snapped. You've been alone, and now you're looking for someone to lean on. But you've chosen him? You've chosen the man who's worked for us for years, but has never been part of this family? His words were sharp, each one cutting through the air like a blade. The room was charged with tension, the air thick with the unspoken truths hanging in the balance. The staff watched in silence, unsure whether to speak or to stay out of it. Some of them were terrified, others curious, but all were equally unsettled by the scene unfolding before them. James stood his ground, his eyes unwavering as he met Daniel's fiery gaze. "You don't know the whole story, Daniel," James said, his voice steady. "You've only seen what you want to see, but there's more to it than that." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of anger and confusion. More? What could be more than this? His voice cracked with disbelief. "What are you hiding, James?" Margaret's voice, barely above a whisper, filled the room. "James has been more loyal to me than anyone in this house," she said, her words trembling with emotion. "He's been here for me in ways you'll never understand." Daniel's gaze flickered toward his mother, and for the briefest of moments he saw the depth of her pain, the exhaustion in her eyes. But his anger was all-consuming, drowning out everything else. "You're defending him?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "After everything I've seen, after everything you've let happen?" Margaret stepped forward, her body shaking as she reached out for him. "Please, Daniel, you're making a mistake. You don't know the truth." Her voice was strained, but there was an urgency in it that Daniel couldn't ignore. But Daniel wasn't listening. His mind was clouded with fury and pride, and the truth, whatever it was, seemed irrelevant in the face of what he thought he saw. "I know enough," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Enough to know that you've betrayed me. Enough to know that you've allowed this to happen." James's voice, calm and resolute, cut through the storm of emotions in the room. "I never betrayed you, Daniel. Not once. But the truth has a way of coming out, whether you want to face it or not." Daniel's chest tightened, the weight of those words sinking deep into his soul. "The truth?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "What truth?" Margaret's sobs filled the room, her body shaking with grief as she collapsed onto a nearby chair. Daniel stood tall above her, his fists clenched at his sides. But even in the heat of his anger, something inside him began to shift. The certainty he had built up over the years, the walls of pride and righteousness he had carefully constructed, started to crack. The pain in his mother's voice, the sorrow in James's eyes, it all started to unravel him, piece by piece. But he couldn't let it, not yet. His anger was a shield protecting him from the pain he wasn't ready to face. "This is your fault, James," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You've betrayed this family, and you will pay for it. You're leaving, now." James's face remained stoic, his gaze unwavering. "If that's what you believe, Daniel, then I'll leave. But remember this, the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It always comes to light, whether you're ready for it or not." And with those final words, James turned and began to walk toward the door, his movements slow but deliberate. Daniel stood there, his chest heaving as he watched James leave, the weight of his words still hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. James walked slowly out of the room, his back straight, his dignity unbroken, even as the weight of Daniel's anger pressed down on him. The servants parted as he passed, their eyes a mix of fear and uncertainty. They had witnessed the fury of their master, but none had ever seen him like this, so consumed with rage, so blinded by pride. The door to the living room closed with a soft click, and the echo of his departure seemed to hang in the air, a final reminder of the tension that had erupted inside the estate. Daniel stood motionless for a moment, his chest rising and falling with each angry breath. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, the real storm had just begun. The quiet tension that had settled over the house felt suffocating. Margaret's sobs filled the room, the sound raw and heartbreaking, but Daniel was beyond hearing it. His mind was clouded with confusion, humiliation, and a deep ache that he refused to acknowledge. "Mother," Daniel said, his voice cold, his tone sharp, "do you really expect me to believe what you're saying? After everything I saw? Do you really expect me to think that man has done nothing wrong?" Margaret looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "Daniel, please, listen to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "James has done nothing dishonorable. He has been more loyal to this family than anyone else, more loyal than your father ever was." Daniel's anger flared again, but this time there was something else there too, a flicker of doubt. He shook his head in disbelief. "You're telling me that man has more loyalty than my own father? You're telling me that he? Not more loyalty than your father, Daniel," Margaret interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "But loyalty that runs deeper than anything you've ever known. Your father was gone often, lost in his work, in his politics, in his own world. James was here when we needed him. He was the one who helped me when no one else was around. He saved me, Daniel. He saved my life." Daniel recoiled as if struck. His mother's words hit him like a slap to the face. His father, the man who had built their empire, the man who had given them everything they had, was being measured against James, a man he had always seen as nothing more than a servant. But now, the weight of his mother's words lingered in the air, forcing him to confront a truth he wasn't ready to face. "James saved you?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Saved you from what? From loneliness? From your own despair?" Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Daniel. When your father wasn't here, when I was drowning in my own sorrow, James was there. He never asked for anything in return. He never took advantage. He was just there. He was the one who saw me when no one else did." Daniel stepped back, his heart heavy with confusion. The image of James, his black jacket, his quiet demeanor, his loyalty, was being shattered before his eyes. He had always seen him as nothing more than a servant, a fixture in the background of their family's life. But now, that image was crumbling, and in its place, a more complicated truth was beginning to form. James wasn't just a servant. He was something more, something Daniel wasn't ready to understand. But he couldn't let go of his anger, not yet. His pride, his ego, his sense of self, all of it was tied up in the idea that he was the rightful heir to the sterling name, that he was the one who should hold the power, the one who should control everything. And James, with his silent strength and unshakable loyalty, threatened that sense of control. "You're wrong, Mother," he said, his voice hardening again. "You've been blinded by your own emotions. You've let him get too close. You've allowed him to play the role of the husband my father once was, and now you're asking me to believe that he's done nothing wrong?" His words were sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Margaret shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached out for him. "I never wanted this, Daniel. I never wanted to hurt you. But you need to understand, James was never trying to replace your father. He was just there for me when no one else was. He gave me something I had lost, a sense of hope, a sense of dignity." Daniel turned away from her, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't accept it. James, the man who had always been on the outside, was now being revealed as something more, a man who had been a source of strength and loyalty when Daniel had been too blind to see it.
"You've made a terrible mistake, Daniel," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "The mistake wasn't with James. The mistake was yours. You've judged him without ever understanding who he really is. You've let your pride blind you to the truth." Daniel stood at the window, his back to her, his mind racing. The truth, he thought. What truth? The storm outside had calmed, but inside, the storm raged on, tearing through the walls of his carefully built life. James's words echoed in his mind. Truth doesn't stay buried forever. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, his fists trembling with the weight of the words. Was that the truth? Had he been wrong all along? Had he been too quick to judge, too willing to protect his pride at the expense of everything else? Daniel sat at his desk later that night, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily in the air. The family estate was still, the usual sounds of servants moving about now absent. The house, so full of life just hours before, now felt like a tomb. The clock on his desk ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder of the storm he had unleashed. Outside, the sky had cleared, but the air inside the mansion still felt thick with the aftermath of what had happened. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the confrontation. His mind replayed the events over and over, each time feeling as if the anger had left him a little more hollow. He had been right, hadn't he? His mother was deceived. James had crossed the line, and he had done what needed to be done. But as the hours passed, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging doubt that something was wrong, something deeper than he had first realized. Margaret's words echoed in his mind, soft but clear. James has been more loyal to this family than anyone else. How could he have missed that? How could he have ignored it for so long?
Daniel stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped across the floor. He walked over to the large window that overlooked the estate's gardens, his gaze drifting out toward the moonlit grounds. The estate was vast, its marble walls gleaming in the pale light, but to him it seemed cold now. A place that once symbolized family and power now felt like a cage, its bars made of pride and judgment. He hadn't thought about the loneliness his mother must have felt, the pain she had carried. She had been alone, abandoned by her husband for long stretches of time, forced to live in the shadow of his empire. And James had been there for her. James, the man who had always been at the gates, had quietly stepped in when no one else had. The truth started to settle in his chest like a heavy stone. He had always thought of James as nothing more than the help, someone who was beneath them. But now, the idea that James had been a part of their family in ways Daniel had never seen, it struck him hard. His world, once so clear and ordered, was suddenly in disarray. Daniel's thoughts turned back to the confrontation. James had never once raised his voice, never once retaliated against his accusations. He had stood there, calm and collected, while Daniel raged. James's silence spoke volumes. But it wasn't just about James. It was about the truth he had hidden from himself for years. His mother's silent suffering, her strength that had never been recognized, and the loyalty that had always been there, quietly building in the shadows. The more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized how blind he had been, how foolish he had been to let pride dictate his actions. How could he have thought that banishing James would solve the problem? How could he have failed to see the man who had stood by his mother, by their family, through thick and thin?
Daniel walked toward his desk again, his mind still in a whirlwind. The letter from his mother that he had been avoiding now seemed like a cruel reminder of his ignorance. He had put it off, unable to face the truth she had written in those pages, the truth that could change everything. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the sealed envelope. The weight of it in his hand felt heavier than it had before. The letter was from years ago, but now it felt like the key to understanding everything that had been hidden. With a shaking hand, he tore the seal and unfolded the letter. The sleek, sterling limousine rolled slowly down a quiet street, its polished black exterior reflecting the warm glow of the streetlights. This wasn't the grandeur of the Sterling estate or the bustling city where Daniel had grown up. No, this was a different world, a humble neighborhood where faded paint covered crumbling brick, where the sidewalks were cracked and children played without a care in the world. Daniel, dressed in simple clothes, dark slacks and a plain shirt, felt his pulse quicken as he looked out the window. He had always prided himself on his wealth, his position, but in this moment, it was as if all of that had melted away, leaving him with nothing but a gnawing sense of guilt and shame. For the first time in his life, Daniel Sterling felt small, humbled by the realization that he had lost something far more valuable than any fortune could ever provide. He stepped out of the car, the rough pavement beneath his feet a sharp contrast to the smooth marble floors of his mansion. This wasn't his world anymore. His world was back at the estate, torn apart by his own actions, and the man he had cast out had now become the key to healing all the wounds he had created. At the door to a small brick apartment, James Whitfield stood, a familiar figure, but one that Daniel had never truly seen until now. His face, weathered with age, had a look of quiet surprise as he saw the man who had once been his employer standing before him. His gray hair was damp from a shower, and his eyes, those deep-set eyes that had always watched over the Sterling estate, looked at Daniel with a cautious but steady gaze. Daniel's throat tightened. The words he had been rehearsing in his mind suddenly stuck. He swallowed hard, his chest heavy with regret. "James, I came to say I was wrong." Daniel's voice cracked as he took a step forward, his heart pounding. "That night, I judged you. I humiliated you. I cast you out without understanding. And all the while you were carrying a truth I never knew." James's brow furrowed, and for the first time Daniel saw the man's composure falter. But his voice remained steady. "Wrong?" James's deep, calm tone was filled with quiet disbelief. "What do you mean, Mr. Sterling?" Daniel stepped closer, his voice trembling. "I've spent my life judging people by what I could see, by power, by wealth. I never stopped to see the man you truly are. Your family, James. You always were, and I was too blind to see it." James's eyes darkened for a moment, the weight of his unspoken emotions showing on his face. "The truth, Mr. Sterling, was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to protect you. But now, perhaps it's time for everything to come to light." Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he realized the enormity of what James was saying. The truth, the one thing he had been too afraid to face for so long. And now, with everything falling apart, Daniel had no choice but to face it head-on. "I've made so many mistakes," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking with guilt. "I cast you out like you were nothing more than a servant. I treated you like you didn't belong in this family. but you're my family. You always have been." His hand trembled as he reached out toward James. "I want you back, not as a servant, but as family. And I want my brother back too. We've all been living in a lie, and it's time we fix that."
James's shoulders sagged, the weight of decades pressing down on him. His eyes filled with emotion, something he had held back for so long, and his voice cracked as he replied, "Do you know what you're asking for, Daniel? Do you know what it means to bring the truth to light? It's more than just forgiveness." Daniel nodded, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. I know it means facing the pain, facing the truth no matter how hard it is, but it also means healing. And that's what we need now. Healing." For a long moment, James didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he extended his hand toward Daniel. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a moment of reconciliation, of unspoken understanding. Their hands met, and in that moment, Daniel felt the weight of his past slip away, replaced by something deeper, something more real than anything he had ever known. The gates of the Sterling estate, once symbols of wealth and power, were now open to something greater. The estate was no longer just a house of marble and money. It had become a home reclaimed by truth, by loyalty, by sacrifice, and by blood that had been hidden for too long. As the sun rose over the California hills, casting golden light across the estate's manicured gardens, James Whitfield returned to the place he had once been exiled from. This time, he wasn't just the guard at the gates. He was part of the family, welcomed back with open arms. The Sterling estate was no longer a place of exclusion. It had become a place of acceptance, where the truth had finally found its place in the light. Daniel stood at the steps of the mansion, his heart beating with anticipation as he waited for the arrival of his brother, his half-brother. The whispers among the staff grew louder, but this time they weren't filled with suspicion. They were filled with awe. Daniel's voice rang out across the courtyard, clear and strong. "This is my blood, my brother. From this day forward, no one in this house will treat him or James as less than family." The staff watched in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others simply stunned by the change that had just occurred. For the first time, the walls of the Sterling estate felt different. They no longer held power, they now held love and understanding. And as Margaret watched, her frail body trembling with emotion, she reached out to join her son and James, her voice breaking. This house was built on marble and money, but today it stands on truth. For Daniel, the weight of his family's legacy, once something he had carried with pride, was now something different. It was no longer about power. It was about love, reconciliation, and the truth that had been buried for so long. He pulled James and his brother closer, feeling the bond of family tighten around them. "We've lived in lies long enough. No more." The chandelier above them shimmered, its light scattering across the room like a new beginning. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the estate in golden rays. The storm that had once ravaged their home had finally passed. And in its place, Daniel found something far more valuable than all the wealth in the world: his family, whole again. As the family stood united, their hearts now free from the burdens of silence and pride, it became clear: true strength isn't measured by wealth, but the love and loyalty we share.
If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something deep inside, do just one thing. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. This is how the power of love and truth continues to spread.